Some truths arrive before language can hold them. They appear as a pulse beneath ordinary attraction, a quiet insistence that a certain presence matters more than preference, more than logic, more than the careful checklist the conscious mind uses to feel safe. Jung saw this hidden knowing as the psyche speaking in symbols through longing, unease, fascination, dread, and the strange feeling of recognition that can bloom in a room full of strangers. The modern world teaches love as performance, chemistry, compatibility, status, timing. Yet beneath that glossy surface, something older is always moving. The unconscious does not bargain with social approval. It does not fall for appearances. It aims for wholeness. This is why a connection can look perfect on paper and still leave the inner life hollow, as if the soul has been politely excluded. The emptiness is not ingratitude, it is intelligence. A deeper self refuses to settle for a story that keeps the spirit small. Jung called the great task individuation, the slow, demanding process of becoming a whole person rather than a well-behaved mask. And in that process, love is not merely a comfort, love is an initiator. It enters like a threshold, and the person who carries that threshold into view is rarely the one the ego expected to choose. The psyche, however, has its own magnet. It moves by archetype, ancient patterns living in the deepest layers of the mind, shaping desire long before desire becomes a decision. Jung described the anima and animus as inner counterparts, those submerged qualities that have been split off by conditioning, by gender roles, by survival, by trauma, by the quiet commands received in childhood about what is allowed and what must be buried. In many women, the animus can show up as voice, will, clarity, the right to take up space without apology. In many men, the anima can emerge as feeling, tenderness, receptivity, the courage to be emotionally honest rather than emotionally impressive. These inner figures are not decorative theories, they are forces. They influence what is chosen, what is feared, what is idealized, what is pursued, and what is repeatedly lost. When a person appears who stirs this inner counterpart, something begins to rearrange itself. It is not simply attraction, it is activation. The psyche behaves as if a locked room has been opened, and air rushes in. Traits that had been dormant suddenly rise, softness returning where hardness once protected, strength awakening where compliance once felt necessary. This is why true love can feel destabilizing. It does not only soothe, it summons. It asks for a larger self than the ego had planned to become. For a woman, this moment can be especially clarifying. The culture often trains women to read love through endurance. How much can be tolerated, how much can be fixed, how much can be carried. But archetypal love does not recruit a woman into self-erasure. It does the opposite. It restores her emotional sovereignty. It makes it harder to pretend. It makes it impossible to keep shrinking. It calls her back from roles that once ensured survival: pleaser, rescuer, the one who stays quiet so the room stays calm. The psyche begins to insist on self-worth as a baseline, not a reward. This is also the moment when projection becomes obvious. Jung warned that people do not fall in love with another person at first. They fall in love with their own unconscious image reflected back at them. They worship the projection, then punish the human when the image cracks. Most relationships never move past this stage. They remain trapped in romance as illusion, conflict as repetition, intimacy as negotiation for safety. But when the bond is part of individuation, the projection does not simply create fantasy, it becomes a mirror that demands honesty. That honesty arrives first as a kind of intimate disturbance. There is the feeling of familiarity that makes no rational sense, as if the psyche recognizes a signature it has been seeking through many wrong turns. Yet alongside that recognition can be fear, not fear of the person, but fear of what must change if the connection is real. The inner world begins to shift, as if furniture is being moved without permission. Old stories start losing their grip. Patterns that once felt like personality begin to reveal themselves as protection. Jung called this the constellation of a complex, a knot of emotion, memory, and belief that lights up when touched. In ordinary love, people defend their complexes as if defending a homeland. In transformative love, the complex is still activated, but it is activated in a way that can be faced. The psyche is not being destroyed, It is being reorganized. It is learning a new structure, one that can hold more truth. This is why the love of a lifetime is not always gentle at the beginning. It can feel like standing at the edge of a larger life. It can feel like the end of certain fantasies, especially the fantasy that love should never require courage, or that growth should never hurt. Yet the discomfort is not a sign of doom. Sometimes it is the sound of the soul waking up after years of living half-conscious. Sometimes it is the first indication that an inner counterpart has been called forth and will no longer accept exile. And still, discernment matters. Not every intense connection is sacred. Not every magnetic pull is destiny. Trauma can mimic archetype. Familiar dysfunction can masquerade as home. Jungian depth does not invite surrender to chaos. It invites clarity about what is being activated and why. A woman does not empower herself by romanticizing intensity. She empowers herself by recognizing the difference between transformation and consumption. Archetypal love expands the self. It does not erase it. It strengthens the inner voice. It does not demand silence. So the beginning of this story is not about finding a perfect person. It is about recognizing a perfect pressure, a pressure toward wholeness that shows up through another human being. The unconscious begins speaking louder, not to promise a fairy tale, but to offer an initiation. The question is not whether love will arrive. The question is whether the soul will be honored when it does, whether the signs will be read with courage rather than confusion, and whether the old self will be allowed to soften its grip so a truer self can emerge. Once the inner counterpart has been awakened, another presence inevitably steps forward from the depths. The shadow. Jung never described the shadow as evil. Though it is often treated that way, it is simply the part of the psyche that was denied expression in order to survive. For many women, the shadow carries anger that was labeled unfeminine, ambition that was called selfish, desire that was judged dangerous, intuition that was dismissed as irrational. It also carries tenderness that had no place to land, creativity that had no permission to exist, and needs that were learned to be liabilities rather than truths. In ordinary relationships, the shadow is kept hidden behind politeness or projected outward and fought through endless conflict. Partners argue about behaviors while never touching the deeper material driving them. One person becomes the container for what the other cannot face. Blame circulates, power struggles replace intimacy, love becomes a negotiation for emotional safety rather than a shared journey toward truth. Jung observed that this is not failure of character, but failure of consciousness. In a bond tied to individuation, something different happens. The shadow does not disappear, but it is no longer required to operate in secrecy. It is seen, more importantly, it is not shamed out of existence. The presence of the other creates a psychological environment where suppressed aspects can rise without immediate punishment. This is rare. It is also unsettling. To be seen beyond the persona, the socially acceptable self, is to risk the collapse of an identity carefully built to avoid rejection. For a woman, this moment can feel like standing naked in one's own psyche. The familiar strategies of self-minimization, emotional caretaking, or silent endurance stop working. The old reflex to apologize for existing loses its power, not because the other person demands confidence, but because the psyche itself begins to insist on truth. Shadow material surfaces not as a problem to be fixed, but as information that wants integration. This is where empowerment moves beyond slogans. It becomes embodied. Emotional sovereignty is not loud dominance or cold detachment. It is the ability to remain present with one's own complexity without abandoning oneself to be chosen. Jung saw this as essential to individuation, the ego learning to withstand the full range of inner life without splitting, repressing, or projecting it away. In such a relationship, confrontation does not feel like war. It feels like invitation. The other does not attack the shadow, nor attempt to polish it into something more acceptable. There is a strange neutrality in the way it is met, a recognition that what has been hidden carries energy, and that energy wants direction rather than suppression. Traits once labeled as flaws begin to reorganize themselves. What was called too much becomes discernment. What was called too sensitive becomes perception. What was called difficult becomes integrity. Jung noted that when the shadow is allowed conscious expression, it loses its destructive power. It no longer needs to sabotage intimacy from behind the scenes. Instead, it becomes a source of vitality. Creativity expands, boundaries strengthen, the psyche feels less fragmented, less exhausted by internal contradiction. Love stops being a performance and becomes a practice of mutual witnessing. Yet this phase is not comfortable. The ego resists. Old identities protest their own obsolescence. There can be fear of loss, loss of control, loss of approval, loss of the familiar suffering that once defined belonging. Many people retreat here, mistaking the discomfort of growth for danger. Jung warned that this is where most transformative bonds are abandoned, not because they are harmful, but because they demand a self the ego has not yet learned to inhabit. For women especially, this moment often reveals a crucial truth. Love that supports individuation does not reward self-sacrifice, it responds to self-honoring. The more a woman integrates her shadow, the less she needs to bargain for safety. Her presence changes, her voice stabilizes, her intuition sharpens. She no longer confuses intensity with intimacy, nor endurance with devotion. She begins to recognize that being chosen at the cost of self-betrayal is not love, but repetition. This does not mean the relationship becomes conflict-free. On the contrary, conflict can deepen, but it no longer circulates around control or dominance. It becomes a shared inquiry. Both partners sense that what is unfolding is larger than comfort. There is an unspoken understanding that something sacred is being shaped, not sacred in a sentimental sense, but in the psychological sense of something that must be approached with honesty and care. Jung believed that when two people can remain present through shadow integration, they create a field of consciousness that supports growth in both directions. Neither carries the other's unconscious material alone, neither is required to shrink so the bond can survive. Instead, the bond itself becomes a vessel capable of holding complexity without collapse. And still, something even stranger begins to occur as this work continues. Meaning starts leaking into events, encounters feel timed rather than random, the outer world begins to echo the inner transformation. The psyche, having committed to growth, seems to find confirmation beyond itself. This is where the next layer reveals itself, not as belief, but as experience where coincidence gives way to pattern, and pattern begins to feel like communication. As the shadow finds language and the inner world stabilizes around greater truth, the psyche becomes more sensitive to meaning. Jung called this sensitivity synchronicity, the experience of events aligning in ways that cannot be explained by linear cause and effect, yet feel unmistakably intentional. These moments do not demand belief, they demand attention. They arrive not to impress the rational mind, but to signal alignment between inner movement and outer reality. In relationships that remain on the surface, coincidence is quickly dismissed, life is seen as a series of accidents, love as chance, timing as luck or misfortune. But when a bond participates in individuation, coincidence takes on a different texture. Encounters occur at improbable moments, decisions converge from unrelated directions, words spoken internally appear externally, mirrored through strangers, books, dreams, or sudden interruptions that reroute an entire path. The psyche begins to experience the world as responsive. Jung observed that synchronicities intensify during moments of psychological transition. When the old self loosens and a deeper structure begins to form, the unconscious seems to enlist reality itself as reinforcement. This is not mysticism in the romantic sense. It is pattern recognition operating at a depth where psyche and world are no longer experienced as fully separate. Meaning becomes the connective tissue. When such synchronicities revolve around a specific person, their effect is unmistakable. The connection begins to feel woven rather than chosen. Paths cross repeatedly without effort. Separation produces echoes rather than absence. Even distance does not dissolve the sense of contact. The rational mind may search for explanations, probability, selective attention, coincidence, but the body registers something else. A quiet certainty that this relationship participates in a larger design. For a woman grounded in self-worth, these experiences do not override discernment. They deepen it, Synchronicity does not remove agency, it refines it. The empowered psyche does not surrender responsibility to fate, nor does it attempt to dominate meaning through control. It listens, it notices, it responds with awareness rather than compulsion. Jung emphasized that synchronicity is not instruction, it is invitation. As the bond matures, the nature of these experiences shifts. External coincidences give way to subtler forms of connection. Emotional states align without communication. Insight arrives simultaneously. Dreams carry shared symbols. Silence becomes communicative. Jung described this as mystical participation, not a loss of boundaries, but a resonance between two individuating psyches that have learned to remain distinct while connected. This state is often misunderstood as dependency. It is not. Dependency collapses the self in order to maintain attachment. Mystical participation requires a self strong enough to remain intact while open. The difference is sovereignty. Each person retains autonomy, yet there is a shared frequency through which understanding travels without force. Jung documented cases where such connections manifested as bodily sensations during moments of danger or emotional crisis, even across great distances. He did not frame these phenomena as fantasy or pathology, but as evidence that consciousness extends beyond the limits the modern ego prefers to accept. What matters is not the phenomenon itself, but what it serves. Alignment with the deeper self. This alignment begins to activate another layer of the psyche, the archetypal field. Within every individual live universal patterns that shape meaning and behavior. The lover, the protector, the seeker, the creator, the wise one. Most people inhabit only a narrow range of these potentials, repeating familiar roles because they feel safe. Life becomes predictable, constrained, dimly dissatisfying. When a relationship participates in individuation, these archetypes awaken in clusters, not as performance, but as access. Courage appears where hesitation once ruled. Creativity returns where duty had suffocated it. Wisdom grows not from age, but from integration. The psyche feels larger, more capable, less divided. For a woman, this activation often carries a profound shift in identity. She no longer relates to herself primarily through accommodation or reaction. She becomes agent rather than mirror. Her intuition strengthens because it is no longer filtered through fear of abandonment. Her leadership emerges naturally, not as imitation of power, but as clarity rooted in self-trust. Love does not make her smaller to be held, it makes her larger and steadier. Jung noted that in such relationships, both partners become catalysts for each other's unfolding. Each holds keys the other cannot access alone. Together, they generate a field where growth accelerates not without difficulty, but with meaning. Challenges no longer feel like threats to the bond, they feel like initiations within it. And beneath all of this, something even deeper begins to form, a sense that life itself is cohering. The scattered experiences of the past start arranging themselves into a narrative that finally makes sense. Pain reveals purpose, delay reveals preparation. What once felt like random suffering begins to resemble training. This is the threshold where love stops being an event and becomes a path, where connection stops being the goal and becomes the context for something larger. Still, something Jung believed. Every psyche is quietly seeking, whether consciously or not. When the psyche recognizes that its experiences are no longer random, a final integration begins to take shape. Jung referred to this as the emergence of the personal myth, the deep narrative through which a life acquires coherence, direction, and meaning. This myth is not chosen, it is discovered. It unfolds slowly, revealing itself through recurring themes, challenges, longings, and encounters that point toward a singular pattern of becoming. Most people live without conscious contact with this myth. They sense its absence as restlessness, as the feeling of performing a role without knowing the plot. Achievement does not satisfy, comfort does not anchor. Even love, when disconnected from this deeper narrative, can feel strangely empty. Jung observed that the psyche longs not only for attachment, but for participation in a story that justifies existence itself. When the love of a lifetime enters the field of individuation, this personal myth begins to clarify. The relationship does not replace the individual path, it illuminates it. Past wounds reorganize themselves as initiations rather than failures. Losses reveal themselves as thresholds rather than punishments. What once appeared as detours now look like necessary preparations for a specific encounter and the growth it demands. For a woman, this recognition can be quietly revolutionary. She no longer measures her worth by how well she fits into someone else's narrative. She sees her life as a myth in its own right, complex, purposeful, and unfinished. Love does not grant her meaning, it meets her in the process of claiming it. This is emotional sovereignty at its highest level, the capacity to love deeply without abandoning authorship of one's own life. Jung called the culmination of this process the union of opposites. It is not the erasure of difference, nor the fantasy of perfect harmony. It is the creative tension between polarities, strength and softness, logic and intuition, autonomy and intimacy held without collapse. In such a union, each partner remains distinct, yet the space between them becomes generative rather than divisive. Meaning is created in the meeting, not in domination or fusion. This is why archetypal love rarely looks like cinematic romance. It does not announce itself with certainty or arrive free of complication. It often begins quietly, even inconveniently, sometimes through friendship, conflict, or shared purpose, rather than overt desire. It asks for patience, honesty, and the willingness to tolerate ambiguity while deeper structures align. Jung noted that the psyche unfolds at its own pace, indifferent to the ego's demand for immediate clarity. Such love also demands courage. It challenges the familiar identities built around survival, especially the belief that love must be earned through self-sacrifice or endurance. The individuated woman recognizes that devotion to truth is not a threat to intimacy, but its foundation. She does not remain where she must disappear to be loved. She does not confuse intensity with destiny, nor suffering with depth. She chooses growth over repetition. This does not make the path easy. On the contrary, relationships that serve individuation often involve greater complexity than those built on avoidance. Conflict arises, fear resurfaces, old patterns test their relevance. But there is a crucial difference. The bond is not threatened by truth, it is strengthened by it. Each challenge becomes another layer of integration rather than a reason to retreat. Jung warned that many people turn away at this stage, not because the connection is false, but because it requires surrendering the illusion of control. Archetypal love cannot be managed through strategy or ego. It demands trust in a process that unfolds from within and beyond conscious planning. It asks the individual to become someone capable of holding depth, without needing certainty at every step. For those who remain, the reward is not perpetual bliss, it is coherence. Life begins to feel lived from the inside rather than performed for approval. Love becomes less about being completed and more about being revealed. The psyche experiences itself as participating in something meaningful, something that extends beyond personal desire into contribution, creativity, and shared purpose. Jung believed that encounters of this kind touch the divine not as doctrine, but as experience. The divine, in his work, was not an external authority, but the organizing intelligence of the psyche, moving toward wholeness. To love in this way is to cooperate with that intelligence rather than resist it. The choice, then, is not simply about staying or leaving, committing or withdrawing. It is about listening. It is about recognizing when the unconscious is pointing toward expansion rather than familiarity. It is about honoring the signs not as guarantees, but as invitations into a deeper version of life. Those signs do not promise comfort, they promise transformation. They do not protect against loss, they protect against stagnation. And for the woman who has learned to trust her inner authority, that distinction changes everything. If this exploration resonated, take a moment to reflect on how your own psyche may be guiding you toward greater wholeness. If the ideas stirred something within, support the conversation by liking the video, sharing it with others who may need it, subscribing for deeper explorations, and adding your perspective in the comments.